History of American football. The history of American football can be traced to early versions of rugby football and association football. Both games have their origin in multiple varieties of football played in the United Kingdom in the mid-19th century, in which a football is kicked at a goal or kicked over a line, which in turn were based on the varieties of English public school football game. American football resulted from several major divergences from association football and rugby football. Most notably, the rule changes were instituted by Walter Camp, a Yale University athlete and coach who is considered to be the father of American football. Among these important changes were the introduction of the line of scrimmage, of down and distance rules, and of the legalization of forward. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, gameplay developments by college coaches such as Eddie Cochems, Amos Alonzo Stagg, Parker H. Davis, Knute Rockne, and Glenn Pop Warner helped take advantage of the newly introduced forward pass. The popularity of college football grew as it became the dominant version of the sport in the United States for the first half of the 20th century. Bowl games, a college football tradition, attracted a national audience for college teams. Boosted by fierce rivalries and colorful traditions, college football still holds widespread appeal in the United States. The origin of professional football can be traced back to 1892, with Pudge Heffelfinger's $500, estimated $13,246.55 in 2019 dollars, contract to play in a game for the Allegheny Athletic. In 1920, the American Professional Football Association was formed. This league changed its name to the National Football League, NFL, 2 years later, and eventually became the Major League of American Football. Primarily a sport of Midwestern industrial towns in the United States, professional football eventually became a national phenomenon. The modern era of American football can be considered to have begun after the 1932 NFL playoff game, which was the first indoor championship game since 1902 and the first American football game to feature hash marks, forward passes anywhere behind the line of scrimmage, and the movement of the goalposts back to the goal line. Other innovations to occur immediately after 1932 were the introduction, the tapering of the ends of the football in 1934, the awarding of the first Heisman Trophy in 1935, the first NFL draft in 1936 and the first televised game in 1939. Another important event was the American football game at the 1932 Summer Olympics, which combined with a similar demonstration game at 1933 World's Fair, led to the first college All-Star game in 1934, which in turn was an important football in the United States. American football's explosion in popularity during the second half of the 20th century can be traced to the 1958 NFL Championship game, a contest that has been dubbed the greatest game ever played. A rival league to the NFL, the American Football League, AFL, began play in 1960. The pressure it put on the senior league led to a merger between the two leagues in the history of American football before 1869. In ancient Greece, men played a similar sport called episkairos where they tried to throw a ball over a scrimmage while avoiding tackles. Forms of traditional football maybe have been played throughout Europe and beyond since antiquity. Many of these may have involved handling of the ball, and scrummage-like formations. These archaic forms of football, typically classified as mob football, could be played between neighboring towns and villages, involving an unlimited number of players on opposing teams, who could clash in a heaving mass of people struggling to drag an inflated pig's bladder by any means possible to markers at each end of a town. By some accounts, in some such events any means could be used to move the ball towards the goal, as long as it did not lead to manslaughter or murder. These antiquated games went into sharp decline in the 19th century when the Highway Act 1835 was passed banning the playing of football on public highways. Football in America. Although there are some mentions of Native Americans playing football-like games, modern American football has its origins in the traditional football games played in the cities, villages and schools of Europe for many centuries before America was settled by Europeans. Early games appear to have had much in common with the traditional mob football played in England. The games remained largely unorganized until the 19th century, when intramural games of football began to be played. Organized varieties of football began to take form in 19th century in English public schools. According to legend, William Webb Ellis picked up the ball and ran with it during a school football match in 1823, thus creating a new style of play in which running with the ball predominated. Football soon began to be played at colleges and universities in the United States. Each school played its own variety of football. Princeton University students played a game called balloon as early as 1820. A Harvard tradition known as Bloody Monday began in 1827, which consisted of a mass ball game between the freshman and sophomore classes, played at the Delta, the space where Memorial Hall now. A poem, The Battle of the Delta, was written about the first match, The Freshman's Wrath, to soothe the direful spring of Shin's unnumbered bruised, great goddess sing. In 1860, both the town police and the college authorities agreed that Bloody Monday had to go. The Harvard students responded by going into mourning for a mock figure called Football Fightum, for whom they conducted funeral rites. The authorities held firm, and it was a dozen years before football was once again played at Harvard. Dartmouth played its own version called Old Division Football, the rules of which were first published in 1871, though the game dates to at least the 1830s. All of these games, and others, shared certain commonalities. They remained largely mob-style games, with huge numbers of players attempting to advance the ball into a goal area, often by any means necessary. Rules were simple, and violence and injury were common. The violence of these mob-style games led to widespread protests and a decision to abandon them. Yale, under pressure from the city of New, the game began to return to college campuses by the late 1860s. Yale, Princeton, Rutgers University, and Brown University began playing the popular kicking game during this time. In 1867, Princeton used rules based on those of the London Football Association. A running game, resembling rugby football, was taken up by the Montreal Football Club in Canada in 1868.